So take your Bibles, go to Matthew 5:27.
What again?
Matthew 5:27. I'm just going to, while you flip there, I'm just going to quickly summarize what we talked about last week. Because last week we did the first half of the second commandment of Christ, which we call guard your eyes. And we talked about how there are different portals of entry into your heart, right? Things can get inside you that affect your heart condition and therefore can change your speech and your behavior, right? We talked about how things can get in through the eyes and the ears and the hands and the feet, and how what you look at, what you listen to, the places that you allow yourself to go, the situations that you let yourself be in, and the things that you do habitually train your heart and your mind either to pursue the world or to pursue the kingdom. And specifically, we talked about looking at a man or a woman in order to lust after them, and that lustful intent in the eyes of God is considered adultery itself, right? And remember that, and I think we have to keep this in mind throughout the entire Sermon on the Mount, is that Jesus is countering these false oral traditions of the Pharisees, in which, in essence, they were saying, it's okay as long as you don't touch, you can look, right? That's kind of like what Jesus was trying to counter. But somewhere along the way, the conversation spun off into a discussion about virtue, which in Peter's list of developing Christian character was second only to faith, and it came before knowledge. Anybody remember how virtue is defined?
Say excellence and morality.
Yeah, excellence and virtue. And I told you that the root word is actually the same word for manliness. And I talked a little bit about how, when you look at Peter's list, he doesn't expect us to have all faith, all virtue, all knowledge, right? These are things that we have to develop and grow, but he does put them in a sort of priority. And we talked about being committed to excellence even before you commit to increasing your knowledge, because if you increase your knowledge without having a commitment to virtue or excellence, then that's probably not going to translate into the next things in the list, which are self-control and perseverance, right? And if you think about it, if all you do is accumulate biblical knowledge without being fully committed to excellence as a disciple of Christ. And the phrase that Peter used was giving all diligence, right? He was saying throw your whole heart into developing these things. Ultimately, knowledge is not going to have the impact that it should if it's not predicated on faith in God and a commitment to excellence on a personal level, right? And we ended with this thought last week. Oops, I guess I need to share my screen, don't I? Give me 1 second here. I should have had this set up before we started. You guys see the 10 Commandments there?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, and you see this next one. Faith is about God's excellence. Remember we ended with that last week? We said faith is about God's excellence and virtue is about yours. And I asked you guys to just think on that, to ponder that throughout this week. And, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands by any means, but, I really hope that you guys spent some time thinking about your own commitment to excellence and having that predicated on faith and pursuing knowledge and self-control, right? So that's the introduction. Hopefully you're Matthew 5:27. We're going to reread the second commandment, and then we're going to go on to the second part. So Matthew 5:27 says, "You have heard it said that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And then he talks about, if your right eye and your right hand cause you to sin, then pluck it out or cut it off and cast it away from you. And in verse 31, he says, and this is now the second half, "Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery." Now, in verse 32, Jesus makes an assumption where, he talks about whoever whoever marries a woman makes the assumption that this is an improperly divorced woman that somebody else marries, right? That's just kind of implied just with the context and the flow of ideas. We've said that this particular commandment is about lust and guarding your eyes, and it is, but ultimately it's about adultery, isn't it? Right? Because he starts out talking about, like in the first half of the commandment, Jesus says, looking to lust is adultery of the heart. And in the second half, he addresses the actual act of committing adultery. We could call it maybe adultery of the body, if you will. But the case that Jesus talks about here isn't quite so black and white. This is one of those passages that I think is just really easy to gloss over and go, yeah, I get it. I got it. Let's move on. So I think we need to pause here and just explain a couple of things. One of the things that's important to know is, like, instead of Jesus saying that if a man improperly divorces a woman and gets remarried himself, then he commits adultery. He doesn't say that, right? He says that if a man improperly divorces a woman and she marries another person, then he has caused her to commit adultery. Right? It's kind of a convoluted way of describing a scenario and a situation. But the way that Jesus wrote this or spoke this, and Matthew wrote it, who's at fault in this scenario?
The man.
Yeah, it's the divorcing man. It's the one who has divorced his wife for improper reasons, right? In fact, Jesus in this passage says absolutely nothing at all about the fault of the woman. And I think it's probably a pretty good takeaway to look at this, that if a woman, or even a man for that matter, is improperly divorced, I don't think the Lord holds him or her responsible for that. He lays it at the feet of, in this case, the husband who divorced his wife for the wrong reason. But this isn't the only teaching on divorce in the Bible, and so we can't build our full understanding of what the Bible says on it just by looking at these through verses, right? We can only develop this complete picture and understanding by looking not just at all the passages, but considering some pretty important, in my opinion, some pretty important cultural and historical context, which I think will help us understand some of the wording and the tactics that Jesus takes. And we'll talk a little bit about Paul if we can get there at the end of the night tonight. But I don't know how prevalent this is, and I'm sure some of you guys have heard this, but there's a segment of Christianity that teaches that if somebody is divorced, they really have only two options, right? Remain divorced or be reconciled with their ex. In other words, that divorce and remarriage, when you marry somebody else, is a state of perpetual adultery. Has anybody heard of this?
Oh, yeah. I heard that many times.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you it's wrong, and tonight I'll show you why it's wrong. Here in Matthew 5, if Jesus was quoting the Pharisees as teaching something like, and I'm just going to paraphrase, if you want to divorce your wife, just give her a certificate and send her on her way. That's kind of the impression that Jesus gives, was the thought of the day. But if that's true, if Jesus was in essence countering that thought, that if you want to divorce your wife, just divorce her, just give her a certificate, what precondition did the Pharisees place on divorce? Or what distinction did they make? Maybe it's a better way to ask it. What distinction did the Pharisees make between proper divorce and improper divorce?
Well, one of the problems the Pharisees had was that they were divorcing and saying you could divorce someone if the woman just did the slightest thing you didn't like. They were very much not adhering to what the Scripture says.
So in reality, they put no preconditions on that. They basically said, if you want a divorce, just divorce her, just give her a certificate, and again, send her on her way, right? They didn't really make much of a distinction between what was, what we would call a biblical divorce versus a non-biblical divorce. But, that's exactly what Jesus was correcting, this false teaching that a man can divorce his wife for any reason at all, or for that matter, a woman can divorce her husband for any reason at all. But is that what the Mosaic law stated? Or was that just one other thing that the Pharisees either made up or, adopted because they were influenced by cultures around them? Does anybody know where divorce is first mentioned in the Bible, in the Old Testament? Yeah, it is Leviticus, right? It's Leviticus 21 and 22, and these instructions are specific to the Levitical priesthood, that Levitical priests were not to marry a divorced woman, right? That's the first mention of divorce in the Bible. If you want the references, it's Leviticus 21:7, 21:14, and Leviticus 22:13. But it's just very simple, right? You're not supposed to marry a divorced woman. But when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees in Matthew 5, and he's kind of quoting the Old Testament, you've heard it said of old, blah, blah, blah. He's not quoting Leviticus. He's actually quoting Deuteronomy 24, which was written 40 years after the instructions for the priest, right? Because when was Leviticus written?
Leviticus was written for the priest. That was their conditions. That was their restrictions.
Yeah, but it was written during that year at Mount Sinai before they went into the wilderness wandering. Right? And Deuteronomy is the speech that Moses gave the children 40 years later after they were finished wandering, right? And when they were getting ready to go into the promised land. So Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 24, yet the very first instructions for divorce came 40 years before that, not long, like literally probably within the year after they came out of Egypt. So the implication is that before Moses gave the law in Deuteronomy that Jesus was addressing in Matthew 5, divorce was a known phenomena among the Jews. So the question is, where did they learn it? Well, where have they just come from?
Egypt.
They had just come from Egypt, right? So I need you to track with me for a minute, right? Before they went into Egypt, Jacob and his family, like the 12 brothers, they all lived in Canaan, right? Canaan being, to the northeast of Egypt, swing up around the Mediterranean, and you're in Canaan. And, then we have the whole story of Joseph being sold into slavery and rising to preeminence in Egypt, and, the family going into Egypt, and then we have the story of all that, right? Well, around the same time, there was an Amorite king. He was the 6th king of the first Babylonian dynasty, and he's very well known. He basically created Mesopotamia because he conquered these surrounding nations, and he set a bunch of laws, and these laws are considered to be the first widely held set of codified laws that were adopted throughout the ancient Near East. Does anybody know who I'm talking about? Hammurabi, that's exactly right, right? So Hammurabi's code was in place in and around the time of Jacob and Joseph and the family going into Egypt, right? That was kind of like the law of the land, so to speak, at least in the eastern part of the Middle East. So Hammurabi's code wasn't the oldest. There were other sets of codified laws that were older than Hammurabi's, but they weren't as widely adopted. But Hammurabi's code was unique in that it was the first set of codified laws that allowed for the presumption of innocence, right? His laws had a tremendous impact on our own legal system today, right? So Hammurabi allowed for the presumption of innocence. He also was the first one to allow in their national legal system for both parties to present evidence in a court of law. Now, granted, he did impose very harsh punishments like death or even dismemberment for certain types of infractions. But he also was one of the first ones to place limits on, for example, what the victim could do to the guilty party, right? So Hammurabi's code is, pretty famous. Obviously, most, if not all of you guys have heard of this. Now, Hammurabi's law had many laws regarding divorce. And many of these laws allowed for divorce for no particular reason. Remember, all of this stuff predates the formation of the Jewish nation, right? So Hammurabi's code allowed for divorce for no particular reason. Some laws, some circumstances, excuse me, required a man to give his wife money as part of the divorce. It was kind of like a divorce fine. A lot of times in divorce, the husband had to give back the wife's dowry, had to give her bride price, so she walked away with some money. But there were other circumstances where there's a provision in Hammurabi's code that if a man didn't want to support his ex-wife, he didn't really have to. So it was actually his choice as to whether or not he gave her some financial support to send her away. Now, in the ancient Near East, it really wasn't good to be a divorced woman, although Hammurabi did make provisions for a woman to divorce her husband, especially if she was a business person and an entrepreneur and she wanted to be independent. She could support herself and go out there and be, kind of like an independent businesswoman. Then she could divorce her husband. Now, that's not to say that is how things were done in Egypt, right? So that's kind of Mesopotamia, the eastern part of the Middle East. But in Egypt, Egyptian law regarding marriage and divorce seems to be fairly consistent across different dynastic periods or Egyptian periods. Egyptian society was based on a nuclear family unit, just like ours is, right? The standard family unit was a husband and a wife who were monogamous, and they had children and brought them up in a monogamous household. And in Egypt, marriage was simply an agreement to live together and to have kids, and required no formal state approval. There was no registry. You didn't have to have a marriage certificate. But typically what happened was that husbands would write a marriage contract, which typically was an agreement with the woman as well as with her father. And the marriage contract would list out the wife's property, right? Her dowry, the money and the possessions that she was bringing into the marriage, as well as what's called the bridal gift. And this was a gift that he would give to her that would be her money. Legally, it was all hers, but as her husband, he had the right to use it while they were married. But if they parted, he was responsible for giving them back to her. It was all kind of orderly and nice and neat and clean. But Egyptian law also required absolutely no reason for divorce. Anybody could initiate it. A man could start it, a woman could start it. But if the man did it, he had to typically give her back the dowry, give her back her bridal gift or the financial equivalent, and he usually had to pay a fine. But if the woman divorced the man, she got all her stuff back, but she didn't have to pay the fine that the husband had to pay. So by the time the Hebrews had lived in Egypt for 215 years, when they came out of Egypt and they went to Mount Sinai, that's most likely the understanding and the concept of divorce that the Jews at Mount Sinai knew. Anybody could divorce anyone for any reason, and hence we start to see in Leviticus now some prohibitions on divorce. We see in Deuteronomy some instructions on divorce. So in Deuteronomy, you have the scenario to the west of the Jews. To the east, you have Mesopotamia and Hammurabi's code. In the ancient Near East, in the ancient Near East and in Egypt, marriage and divorce was free and easy, especially if you were a man, especially if you were the guy, right? So after God called his people out of Israel and gave them the law, and they became the nation of Mount Sinai when they entered into the covenant. They became the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai when they entered into the covenant with God. God had to then clarify his purpose and his expectations, because these people would naturally follow what they knew for the last 200 years from Egypt, or they would begin to follow what they might learn as they forged east and encountered cultures that had adopted the code of Hammurabi, right? The influence of the Mesopotamian nation or the Babylonians. So we need to understand not only, in order to understand what Christ is saying and what he's fighting against in Matthew chapter 5, we have to understand not only what the Jews knew from Egypt or were likely to learn from the Babylonians, we also have to ask what influence did both Greece and Rome have in teaching the Jews in the decades, maybe even a couple of hundred years before the time of Christ, because that was another cultural influence as well, right? In ancient Greece and ancient Rome seemed to be variations on a theme. Grecian divorce would have had a tremendous impact on the Jews through the whole Hellenization process, right? Think about the Maccabean revolt and the impact of Greek culture and philosophy and how it kind of started to rip the nation apart back then. Very, very early Rome had the same kind of men had all the power mentality that we see in these other more ancient civilizations. But, by the time we get to the 1st century before Christ, in Rome, men and women were on equal legal footing. And in both Greece and Rome, divorce was simply a decision to no longer be married, and there was no legal requirements. You didn't have to ask permission. You didn't have to file a complaint. You didn't have to register a reason. You just one day wake up and just walk out, and you were done. And in fact, there is evidence in ancient records that divorce happened if you just simply went and married somebody else. Like you just wake up one day and go, I'm just gonna go marry Joe. I don't like you anymore. I'm gonna marry Joe. And in marrying Joe, that divorce with Sam, I'm just picking names, obviously, that was nullified. So this is the history, and that's the current climate that Jesus was speaking from and speaking into in Matthew chapter 5. But none of it was what God intended for his people, is it? Right? Now jump forward to Matthew 19. The Pharisees challenged Jesus on this matter, even though he had already taught on this topic in the Sermon on the Mount. Granted, the Pharisees that are cited in Matthew 19, they're not the same Pharisees who might have heard Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount, which was north at the Sea of Galilee. And it was probably well before what we're reading here in Matthew 19. So we're going to give them a pass, right? Jesus already taught on it, but they're asking specific questions that they would understand his position if they had seen the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew 19:1 says this. It says, "Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these sayings, that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' And notice this, 'for just any reason.'" Now, why do you think that they asked that? Why didn't they just say, "Isn't it lawful to divorce a man to divorce his wife?" Why did they add "for just any reason"?
I think they wanted to test Jesus to see if he'd be, in line with what the law had said previously, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of mostly there. I mean, it even says that they were testing him, right? But the test wasn't the question on divorce. The test was the clause "for just any reason." That was the sneaky part, right? And you're right. Every one of these questions and challenges were traps. They were the current authority on the law, right? So if Jesus said yes, then Jesus was simply confirming what they were doing themselves and what they were teaching the people, right? You have heard it said that if you want to divorce your wife, just give her a certificate. That's what they were doing. But if he said no, then they were going to hit him up with the following question, which we see in verse 7. But what they didn't expect was the answer that he gave them a little bit later, or actually in verses 4 and 6. So he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother to be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So then they are no longer two flesh, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate." And that's a pretty big statement, right? That basically says mankind has no business messing around with the things that God has established. But that's exactly what mankind does, and that's certainly exactly what the Pharisees and the Sadducees had done, right? Now, maybe this is a good time to remind ourselves why does God even care about marriage and divorce? What do you think?
Marriage is a picture of Christ and his church. So it's an institution that is supposed to glorify and reflect him.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. What came to my mind when I was putting this together was Psalm 2 and the whole book of Malachi. Specifically Malachi 2, right? In Psalm chapter 2, the Father promised his Son an inheritance of land and people. And in Malachi, he says that he wants the people and their children to be godly. Right? That's really ultimately what God was after for his people. And this is why he had to put restrictions on things that were free and easy in the ancient cultures, like divorce. Like, he said, you're my people. You're not going to act like all these others. They do it this way. We're going to do it like this. And here's why. Because I made a man and woman in the beginning, and they're going to join together and be one flesh and populate the world with godly children. And what I have made, man will not mess up. Which, of course, we did, right? So what Jesus did was, he said, forget what you've learned from the Greeks and the Romans. Forget what your ancestors learned from the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. Let me remind you what the Father said. That's his answer, right? And so then the Pharisees, they tried to throw Moses in his face, right? And this was their trap. This was their trap in verse 7. But you have to read this. You have to read this with a little bit of scorn in your voice to really get kind of how they were speaking to him. So they said to him, well, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? And he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Kind of the same thing that he said, exactly the same thing back in Matthew 5. He's pretty consistent. So why do you think the Pharisees had such a wrong view on divorce?
They were being the wife of their youth. When she started to age or whatever, they'd marry a younger woman, they'd toss her aside.
Yeah, we're going to look at those verses in Malachi coming up in a little bit. One of the reasons why they had such a wrong view on divorce was because of these historical cultural influences that we just talked about, right? How the Egyptians did it, how the Mesopotamians did it, how the Greeks did it, how the Romans did it. Plus, the Pharisees were simply carrying on in the tradition of their Levite predecessors, right? The ones that Malachi lambasted for many things, including, like Kathy said, divorcing their wives just because they get tired and wanted a newer model. But before we go there, I think I want to go back to Deuteronomy 24. So just go back there. I want to look at the law specifically as Moses gave it in Deuteronomy 24. We're going to start in verse 1. So Deuteronomy 24:1 says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness. Now, the Septuagint says that he has found a shameful thing. So because he has found some uncleanness or shameful thing in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, this is a series of like nested if-then statements. If this, then that, and if this, and then that. Kind of building. It can be a little bit difficult to straighten this out. But in this scenario, does the first husband have cause for divorce? Is this what we would call a proper or biblical divorce?
Well, it depends on what you define as the uncleanness in her.
No, it's not how we define it.
Well, it's how what I'm saying is how it's defined.
Right. So what is it?
Well, uncleanness means something shameful. The only thing I could think of shameful is that he discovered somehow that she had sexual immorality.
Yeah, and so this is one of the big questions, right? Is Moses here just talking about adultery, physical adultery, having an affair? Moses actually leaves it ill-defined, at least from our perspective. And it's quite possible that in Moses' day that shameful thing included but was not limited to adultery. And in fact, I think if we're just reading the English translations and going with the natural conclusions of where that language tends to leave us, it seems like Christ was talking specifically about sexual immorality, adultery, that's the only reason a man can divorce his wife or vice versa. But Moses had a little bit of a broader concept, right? Something that was shameful, because he doesn't say specifically sexual immorality or adultery, does he?
Well,
go ahead.
Jesus used the word fornication.
We'll get there. Oh, so go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And fornication encompasses more than just sexual immorality. It includes idolatry.
Right, and we hold on to that thought, right? Because you're like maybe a 1.5 step ahead of me. Kathy, were you going to say something?
Yes, but I have since forgotten it.
Sorry.
That reminds me, some people today get a divorce and they won't really pinpoint the reason. They'll say, well, it's just irreconcilable differences. But that's just a cover for the real reason.
Yeah, that's right. In here in Deuteronomy 24, the word that's translated in the Septuagint as a shameful thing, the word is ashkamon. It's actually an exceedingly rare word, whether it's used as an adjective, a noun, or a verb. The word actually, it literally means without shape or form. That's what it means. So this shameful thing has no form. It's got no shape. And what it refers to is it refers to a lack of conformity to what is considered allowable or appropriate. It can be used to, say that you're going against the norm or going against a set of rules or expectations. And that could be either culturally, societally, could be religiously, it could be sexually. And one of the few instances of this particular word in the Old Testament is in the story of how, you remember the story of Shechem and how he seduced Dinah? I mean, it was consensual, it wasn't rape, but he seduced her and she did it willingly, but the Bible says that he shamed her. And it's the same word, right? And again, the story is not about rape with Shechem and Dinah, but it's about the shame that comes from consensual premarital sex. That word is also used in the New Testament in Romans chapter 127, where Paul talks about men burning in lust for one another, and he calls it a shameful thing. It's the same word, right? So the implication, the rarity of the word and the consistent use of it implies, or let me say it this way, the implication is not that the shameful thing in Deuteronomy 24 is sexual in nature, but the implication is that the shameful thing is something that was apparent to the outer senses, something that others could observe, that they could learn about and know about, and the external observation and knowing is what brought shame on the person or upon a nation. Right? That's the core meaning of this word, ashkamon, or the shameful thing, right? Her husband discovers a shameful thing. She's done something that's not right, but it's not pinpoint down to sexual immorality. It's not that precise, right?
No.
Now, in the era of the pre-incarnate Christ, when he gave this law to Moses, right? Like I said a moment ago, he used the law to distinguish the Jews from all of the other pagan nations. So what husband number one discovered was that his wife wasn't following some aspect of the law that separated the Jews from the pagan world, right? So husband number one discovers this shameful thing. He divorces his wife appropriately. It could have been a sexual sin. She could have been worshiping idols, like Walter said, or she otherwise was acting shamefully for others to see her doing that. So husband one divorces her, and then she goes and she marries somebody else. Now Moses, in the second marriage, shows two different hypotheticals. One is either the second husband ends up hating her and divorces her, or he dies and she's released from the second marriage, because that's part of the law, right? Death released you from the marriage contract. But in either case, the first husband was not to take her back, regardless of what happened. So here's a question. Does Moses tell us why husband number two hates his wife?
Why he what?
Why he hates her? In one of the hypotheticals, right? In verse 3, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, does Moses tell us why?
No.
So again,
Just that he detests her, that's it.
that's all he says, right? So option one is he just hates her. Like, he gets tired of her. And so he divorces her improperly and not for legitimate reasons. Or option number two, husband number two discovers the same shameful thing that husband number one discovered. And now she is doubly defiled because she's divorced by two men, because she apparently hasn't repented of the shameful thing that caused the first divorce. Now, we can't tell for sure, but the way this is written, I tend to favor option number two, that she was doing the same old thing. Husband number two figured it out, and he hated her because she did the same thing to him that she did to the first husband.
Agreed.
Right? Again, not stated explicitly, but I think it's implied.
It is because of what is said earlier about the uncleanness in her. The first one found. In the context then that these are believers, these are Jews, the followers of Jehovah, they would have to be under the same context and same regulations.
Yeah. And yes, the implication is husband number two was a Jew as well, right?
Right.
So she did not find favor with husband number one, but husband number two hated her, right? And there's another escalation. We talked about escalations a couple of lessons ago. And maybe husband number two knew what she did to husband number one, but married her anyways for whatever reason, foolishly thinking that she wouldn't do the shameful thing when she was married to him, yet she did. Right? Again, I'm just kind of being a little bit speculative, but I think it's pretty reasonable as we've talked about it. But, whether husband number two died or whether he divorced her for the same shameful offense, she was not to be reconciled to her first husband. Because it says, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving to you as an inheritance. And listen, that kind of language, like not bringing sin on the land and these things being abominations, that kind of language sounds an awful lot like the warnings that are scattered throughout the Old Testament that are consistent with the warnings against adopting pagan practices, right? Whether that was regarding idol worship or these loose laws of marriage, divorce, and then remarriage. And it was all against God's original mandate that what God has joined together, man may not separate. But it seems like the Pharisees, go ahead and go to Malachi chapter 2. It seems like the Pharisees were all about the easy divorce. It's funny that we're talking about this today. As Kathy and I went into town to pick up my crutches and my cane for my post-op stuff, just so I can walk around after the surgery. And as we were driving back home, we stopped at a stop sign somewhere, and I saw this. It was a placard that was just like nailed to a light pole, and it said divorce $139. Now, we are a nation of easy divorce. right? We're no different than any of these ancient cultures. Now, let's get some more context here, because Jesus was again addressing a specific problem among the Pharisees. We'll talk about Malachi chapter 2, because remember, the Pharisees were just the extension. They were just the modern version of the Levites that Malachi was land-basting, right? Malachi, of course, being written to and against the Levitical priest, and most scholars put the writing of the book of Malachi somewhere around 400 BC, right? So this was, mark what's called the intertestamental period. Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. Matthew's the first book of the New, right? And the point to note is that the issues with lust and divorce among the Pharisees that Jesus was addressing was simply a continuation of what we read here in Malachi, right? Malachi 2, verse 13. Now, I'm going to read this from the Septuagint, but follow along in your Bibles there. Most of it is very, very similar, so it shouldn't be very hard to track, but there are a couple of verses like 14 and 16, I think it is, that do read a little bit differently, that I think just add dimension. They don't contradict anything. I think it just gives it a slightly bigger dimension. So Malachi 2:13, and these things which I hate you do. You cover with tears the altar of the Lord, and with weeping and groaning from troubles. Yet is it worthy to look upon the sacrifice or take an acceptable gift from your hands? And you said, because of what? Well, because the Lord has testified between you and between the wife of your youth, whom you deserted, even though she is your partner and the wife of your covenant. And he did not make her good, or did he not make her good? Yet she has the residue of his breath. And you said, what other offspring does God desire? So then observe yourselves, and do not desert the wife of your youth. But if, while hating, you divorce your wife, says the Lord God of Israel, you will conceal the wrongdoings of your thoughts. There you go, Mary. There's your irreconcilable differences. Right? But here's what it says, verse 16. But if while hating you dismiss or divorce your wife, you will conceal the wrongdoing of your thoughts, says the Lord Almighty. So observe yourselves and never desert your wife. You are the ones irritating God with your words, but you said, in what way have we irritated him? When you say everyone doing evil is good before the Lord, and with them he is himself pleased. And where is the God of justice? You know what Malachi was saying there in verse 17? And this is true of the Pharisees. They were either deluding themselves or intentionally saying things like, what we're doing is fine. Everything's good. There's no justice from God. We haven't been struck by a lightning bolt, so obviously God is happy with us because we've had no judgment. That's what he's saying. That's the attitude of the Levites that Malachi was countering, and it's the same attitude that the Pharisees had. Now, in verse 16 in the New King James, and it says that God hates divorce, right? Does anybody have like an ESV or an NASB or an NIV?
I have NIV, I think.
What does that say, Emily?
Where says it again?
Verse 16. Does it say that he hates divorce?
Yes, it specifically says, I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel.
Yeah. So he hates it, but he didn't forbid it, did he?
No.
He didn't forbid it, but he made his position extremely clear. And he defines for us what biblical grounds are and what they are not. In the Septuagint, the translation in verse 16, again, it's a little bit different. It's the Levite who's hating his wife while he divorces her, but he's concealing his real reasons for doing so. Go back to Deuteronomy 24, because Moses, 2 chapters earlier, go to Deuteronomy 22. Moses actually addressed men making false accusations to get a divorce as an example of, someone concealing his true reason in his heart. Deuteronomy 22:13 says, if any man takes a wife and goes into her and detests her and charges her with shameful conduct and brings a bad name on her and says, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I found that she was not a virgin. Then the father and mother of the young woman shall take and bring out the evidence of the young woman's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. And the young woman's father shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man as wife, and he detests her. Now he has charged her with shameful conduct, saying, I found your daughter was not a virgin. And yet these are the evidences of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city. Does everybody know what we're talking about here? The cloth?
Yeah.
I mean, just in case somebody doesn't, it's like when Jews got married, they had the ceremony, and then went straight into the marriage tent, and they consummated their marriage. And they did it on a cloth. Theoretically, if the wife was a virgin, forgive me for saying it this bluntly, she would bleed, and the evidence of her virginity would be on the cloth, right? And so in this scenario, the man is lying, saying, oh, she wasn't a virgin, and the father and mother are going like, here's the sheet, here's the cloth. We've got proof that she was a virgin. So in verse 18, it says, if the man is caught lying, then the elders of the city shall take that man and punish him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, and give them to the father of the young woman, because he had brought a bad name on a virgin of Israel. And she shall be his wife. He cannot divorce her all of her days, or all of his days. All right? That's one absolute prohibition on divorce, one circumstance. And that's, what is significant about that particular statement, he cannot divorce her all his days, is that it's a pretty stark contrast to the pagan nations, right? Pretty stark, where you can just go divorce someone by walking away, by marrying somebody else. So once again, what happened when the leaders themselves shifted the standard to allow themselves to divorce for made-up reasons? God permitted divorce under certain circumstances, but the leaders took advantage of their position and their authority over the people, and they did it predominantly for their own advantage. Now, starting in verse 20, Moses addresses stoning for fornication and adultery in different scenarios. And I want to go over these just simply because we're here, and sometimes these verses are used by Bible critics to paint a picture of, religious barbarism and all that kind of stuff. But these critics, for some reason, tend to single out the Jews. For example, Hammurabi's code, which predated the law, required an adulterous woman to be drowned. Right? The ancient Aztecs had laws that said an adulterous woman had to be impaled publicly. Greece and Rome at various times killed adulterous women, and even today in some parts of the Middle East and Africa and India, there are still honor killings for women that are caught behaving or misbehaving sexually, right? So, in cases like that, I think Bible critics are not being intellectually honest, because they tend to single out Christians and Jews for that particular reason. Now, what this means is, I'll get to you in a second, Mary. We're going to go through these, and depending on how, I might not get through everything I wanted to get through, but that's okay. All right, Mary, what do you want?
Very interesting. There are no penalties for a man who is not a virgin.
Doesn't seem to be stated, does it?
Anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, we got lopsided laws.
Well, God has his reasons. Doesn't make it lopsided.
I don't know. There's got to be that. Why? Why would that happen? I know some of them had 2 or 3 wives, so if you didn't like the first one, just marry another one. And you didn't have to divorce them. Then marry another one if you didn't like that one.
Well, certainly the history of the Jewish people is full of them doing things that God didn't approve of, right? Nevertheless, let's look at these different scenarios here. In verse 20 and 21, this is the first scenario, and this regards the accusation of a woman not being a virgin on the wedding night, right? So this is still a continuation of that story we just read. But if the thing is true, like if indeed she is not a virgin, and evidence of virginity is not found for the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done a disgraceful thing in Israel, to play the harlot in her father's house. So you shall put away the evil from among you. Scenario 2, in verse 22, assumes that the physical interaction is consensual. It says, if a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then both of them shall die. The man that lay with the woman and the woman who consensually lay with the man, so you shall put away the evil from Israel. Scenario 3 and 4, both about a betrothed woman. Hang on there, Walter. Verse 23, if a young woman who is a virgin is betrothed to a husband. Now, in ancient Jewish culture, if you were betrothed, you were considered legally married, even though you hadn't gone through the ceremony yet. But if a young woman who is a virgin is betrothed to a husband, and a man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she didn't cry out in the city, and the man, because he humbled his neighbor's wife, so you shall put away the evil from among you. But if a man finds a betrothed young woman in the countryside, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. There is in the young woman no sin deserving of death. For just as when a man rises against his neighbor and kills him, even so is this matter. For he found her in the countryside, and the betrothed young woman cried out, but there was no one to save her. Now, what in scenarios 3 and 4, where something happens in the city and something happens in the country, like, what difference does it make where it happened?
Well, in the city, you might likely have some people around who can come and save you. Out in the country, you're totally, there's no you have no defense at all.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. The assumption is that if a man lies with a woman in the city, if it wasn't consensual, there's someone close by that if she yelled out, she would have been heard. So the assumption is, if it happened in the city and you didn't complain, you were part of it. But if it happens in the countryside, the assumption is that she's innocent because there was no one to hear her if she had cried out, right? And one of the things that's interesting is that this particular scenario is also recorded in the Code of Hammurabi, right? And the perspective is exactly the same, talking about rape in the countryside versus consensual sex in the city. But the woman who is forced is innocent, right? That's not adultery. Rape is not adultery, and therefore is not condemned under the law, or was not condemned under the law. Scenario 5 is a woman who is not betrothed, but the physical interaction is also not consensual. Verse 28, if a man finds a young woman who is a virgin who is not betrothed, then he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife because he has humbled her. He shall not be permitted to divorce her all his days. And a man shall not take his father's wife, this actually refers to the stepmother, nor uncover his father's bed. So Moses is covering many different possible scenarios, right? He's talking about different locations. He's talking about if a woman is betrothed, if she's married, if it's consensual, if it's not consensual. He's trying to paint as large and detailed a picture of the conditions under which physical intimacy is considered a stoning offense or not. Is it considered adultery or not? Walter, you were going to say something a few minutes ago.
Yes, and I think we mentioned it before in another study a while back, but when the woman caught in adultery was brought to Jesus, they only brought the woman, they didn't bring the man. And under the Mosaic covenant, both parties had to be killed, not just one. So they were trying to trap Jesus, and that's how I see it. So Jesus, instead of saying, well, where's the man too, and killing both of them, he took the opportunity to point out the fact, well, you without sin cast the first stone, showing their hypocrisy, because they were also with sin themselves. But yet Jesus knew the Mosaic law because he gave this to Moses.
Yeah.
And therefore, that's why he couldn't allow her to be stoned by herself, because that would be violating the law.
I don't know if I would conclude it that way, Just like if you witnessed a crime where two kids were shoplifting and you caught one and the other one got away, you wouldn't let the one you caught go just because you didn't catch the other one, right? So I don't think that's necessarily an automatic interpretation. I see your point. I think it's possible, but it doesn't say what happened to the man. They could have had him sequestered somewhere else. I mean, we just simply don't know, and I don't think we can tell from the way it's written. Here's a question for you guys. If adultery requires stoning, why did Moses allow for a certificate of divorce if the wife was only going to be stoned anyways? Assuming that a wife committed adultery against her husband.
I think it was a deterrent.
Because there's a way to go about it, the proper channels. That, am I right?
I don't know. Well, maybe make your point.
Well, obviously, someone could put away his wife, right? And then she is free to go and marry somebody else, correct?
So are you saying that stoning wasn't the punishment for all people who commit adultery?
No, I'm saying there's a remedy if someone wants to put away their wife under the Mosaic law, for her then to be married to somebody else. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
Well, I just wanted to see what everyone else thought. I think that if you read through these passages pretty carefully, it seems to be that stoning was the automatic offense for people who were caught in the act, which is exactly what Walter was saying in the incidents in the New Testament, right? It's people who were actually caught in the act that were required to be stoned, right? And it doesn't say about, like if someone you discover, like back in Deuteronomy 24 or forward in Deuteronomy 24, let's assume that the man discovering the shameful thing discovered that his wife had an affair. Well, he divorced her. I mean, she wasn't caught in the act, so she wasn't given a stoning offense. He was allowed to give her a certificate of divorce and, again, send her on away. And I think that that's the only way that we can reconcile an apparent contradiction, is that stoning for adultery was not required in all cases, but it was required when people were caught in the act, which is why the Pharisees in the New Testament said specifically to Jesus, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. That basically said, we're watching to see what you said because the law says she has to be stoned to death. And here they are all standing there with the stones in their hands. Mary.
In today's courts, there are a lot of women with the rape, with the victim problem, where the women will not even come forth because they know they have to have so much evidence and proof. They'll say, if he said, and she said, and it's really difficult to prove it. So a lot of them keep quiet about it and they cover it up and they don't even want to go to court about it.
Yeah.
And so they're pretty much, it's a terrible thing. You look at Judge Kavanaugh and all that problem that he went through.
Yeah.
With being accused falsely. So.
Yeah, it's a messy business, isn't it? Mm-hmm. A few minutes ago I said that in Deuteronomy 24, Moses uses the term, at least in the Septuagint, shameful act, and how that applies to a broader range of offenses, including things like idolatry. If we go back to, and we don't have to go there, but in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, when Jesus says that the only reason for divorce is sexual immorality, that's the English translation. Walter pointed out that the word is fornication. The word actually is porneia, which is the word, that's where we get pornography and porno from, right? But in the New Testament, this Greek word porneia, fornication, it's either translated either as sexual immorality or as fornication. So the question is, in the New Testament, we see this application that the shameful thing is a broader thing than just having a physical affair with someone, just having sex with somebody else. Could be idolatry, could be pagan worship, could be a whole bunch of different things. In either case, it's shameful and it doesn't conform to God's expectations and what the law requires. So in the New Testament, was Jesus saying in Matthew 5 and 19 that the only reason for a proper divorce is sexual immorality? Is he saying that the only reason for divorce is because your wife or your husband had an affair? Or is he doing exactly what Moses did and used the word porneia in the broader sense? Because what we know is the word fornication is quite often used in the Old Testament and the New to refer to spiritual adultery, right? Idolatry. We know that. We see it over and over and over again, right? So I'm just going to read you a couple of examples here just to kind of prove the point. This Greek word porneia in the Greek version of Numbers 14:33 says this, "But your sons will feed in the wilderness for 40 years, and they will pay for your faithlessness," same word, "until your corpses are consumed in the wilderness." Well, what is the faithlessness? The whole Kadesh Barnea thing, right? There's multiple examples throughout the book of Hosea, but let me just read a couple of things here. Hosea 4:7. "In accordance with their multitude, thus they sinned against me. I will turn their glory into dishonor. They will eat the sins of my people, and they will take their lives by their injustices. And just as the people will do, so also the priest. And I will avenge against him his ways, and I will repay him his counsels. And they will eat and never be full. They prostituted themselves and did not prosper, because they omitted guarding the Lord. The heart of my people received whoredom and wine and intoxicating drink. They inquired with omens, and they used to bring news to him with his staves. They were led astray by a spirit of fornication." That's the word porneia. "And they have fornicated away from their God." And he goes on and he talks about your daughters will commit fornication. They commit adultery. The women or the nation prostitutes itself, right? So, and listen, there's a very, very strong precedent in the Old Testament that shows the general use of the word porneia or fornication is not the literal sexual immorality, but far more often it's referred to spiritual infidelity, way more than it actually means sexual immorality or fornication or adultery, right? And it's all throughout Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Nahum, and Micah. Like pretty much all of the prophets, whenever you see this word porneia, fornication, it's not talking about the physical act. It's talking about the spiritual. It's talking about false worship. So if we look at Deuteronomy 24 again and conclude that the shameful thing that causes a man to properly divorce his wife is broader than just physical adultery, why would we presume that Jesus was then narrowing proper divorce down to physical adultery? Why would we make that assumption? You know, why would Jesus say a Jewish man, what do you think Jesus would say a Jewish man should do if he found his wife, you know, lighting incense and praying to Dagon in the middle of their home? Oh, that's just her thing. I just let her do her thing. I think he'd take that very, very seriously. Kathy.
Well, yeah, because that would be an influence to his children.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah. But that goes both ways, right? I mean,
yes, for sure. Walter.
And assuming that person, they were both believers at one time, and the one decides to start now worshiping Baal or whatever, that person has committed spiritual adultery to God. And therefore, now you have what was a holy marriage with God involved in this. There was the three-way covenant there. Now it's no longer that, because that person hasn't been God.
You know, the phrase, the statement that you see several times associated with these scenarios in the Old Testament is, "Thus you shall put away the evil from the nation of Israel." Right? So in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, Jesus isn't only talking about sexual immorality, even though that's how it's translated. The broader, the most common use of that word relates to spiritual infidelity. So again, just like Moses, it could be anything. It could be adultery, physical adultery, but it could be pagan practices. It could be something that was totally shameful, that brought shame upon the home, upon the family, upon the nation. You know, in particular with Paul, it seems like in the epistles that word is also used. I'm sorry, I should say, let me say it this way. In Paul's epistles, he quite often uses the word porneia to mean fornication, like in the literal sense, right?
Right.
Several cases that word is actually used right next to the word idolatry. So if fornication and idolatry appear next to each other, it's not the same thing, right? So one is literal fornication, the other one is idolatry. So we know in some cases, in Paul in particular, he does talk about sexual immorality, but context, I think, is pretty easy to figure out which of those are. But, you know, in all of the cases where Paul uses that word in a literal way, in every single case, he's writing to Gentile churches who probably wouldn't recognize the use of the word porneia to refer to spiritual adultery. That's just the way God used that word, right? That seemed to be a Jewish use stemming from the Old Testament time, right? And so it's also not surprising that John in the book of Revelation, borrowing heavily from the Old Testament, of course, uses porneia and fornication again to mean spiritual adultery. So I am of the opinion that in Jesus' day, the Jews hearing the Sermon on the Mount, when they said that a man divorce his wife except for porneia, he's using that word in the broader sense, and it would include spiritual infidelity, unless there's something that's, you know, in the immediate context that would restrict it to a sexual relationship.
Emily.
So for shameful acts, could that include like abuse of a spouse that's continuous, or doing something that really harms the family, such as like an addiction that kind of destroys the family from within?
What do you think?
I struggle because I had a friend who was married for 10 years, and throughout those 10 years of marriage, it was a constant. He would do very shameful acts that hurt and eventually could have destroyed their family after 10 years.
Were they both believers?
He claimed to be at one time, but I think his behavior and his fruit over that long period of time showed that he wasn't living out his faith. He wasn't producing any fruit, and so. Yeah, it was tough. I didn't know what to.
So.
But the church basically, told her at the time that she should stay, even though he was drug addicted and he was bringing her into drugs and around the children and some other different shameful acts as well.
Yeah. So I mean, my opinion is that fits into the paradigm. You know, if you ask the question, what is the appropriate behavior of a Christian husband and father? You know, how do you conform to that? And is your behavior conforming to that? And the answer is no, then that's a shameful thing. That, I believe, could probably be grounds for biblical grounds for divorce, for sure. Now, we're out of time. It's a good stopping point right now, because what I want to do next time is take a look at this idea of perpetual adultery. Right, what we've been doing is kind of laying the groundwork of what we know for sure, what we conclude with some reasonable rationalization or speculation, I guess, and try to fill in our understanding of what God's intent was, the cultural and the historical influences that led to the Pharisees teaching what they were teaching, and exactly what is Jesus adding to that, or what is he correcting. But there is this idea that, again, if someone gets divorced, a Christian gets divorced and marries somebody else, then they're in a state of perpetual adultery. And that's, again, not biblically accurate. So we're going to look at that very specifically, and we'll look at some verses that are commonly misinterpreted and used to support that false view. And then we'll take a look at some of the scenarios. In fact, we'll talk about some of the verses in Paul where he gives guidelines for married Christian couples and then mixed couples where you have a Christian married to a non-believer, right? Because he's got guidelines and he's got rules and he has wisdom for all of those different scenarios.